The first decision that we need to make is what template should we use to create our project. So go to Visual Studio, create a new project, make sure that it is an MVC web application, version 4 in this case, and let's call this Ribbit MVC. In the next window, we get to choose the template that we want to base our project on. Some of these are obviously choices that we do not want to use, like intranet application or Facebook application. But there are 3 that are pretty good candidates: empty, basic, and internet application. The internet application template gives us a lot of things out of the box. The simple membership provider is automatically enabled so that we could use that if we wanted to. That means we could use the web security class for user authentication. But really, the simple membership provider is very limiting as far as functionality. It also creates an application that already has views and controllers, and a lot of that stuff we just don't need because we're not going to use it. So really, the internet application is nice, but it gives us a lot of extra fluff that we don't want to use. So we could choose either basic, which also has some extra fluff, or we could just go with empty. And I am going to go with empty because we are going to build just about everything from scratch. We are not going to use ASP.NET's membership system or their profile system. We are going to write our own systems. So let's just create an empty application. And we are going to start by creating our lower level data access code. Now, when I use the term lower level, I immediately think of ADO.NET, and we're not going to go that low. Instead, we are going to use Entity Framework code first. This means that we write the classes that represent individual tables, and then Entity Framework will create the necessary database and tables based upon the code that we write. So the first thing we need to do is set up the connection string. So go to web.config, and there's going to be a connection string already added. Or is there? No, it's going to make a liar out of me. And I guess I'm thinking of the internet application. So we can add our own connection string. Make sure that you are inside of the configuration element, and we just want to add the connection strings element. Then we want to use the add element inside of connection strings. Let's give this a name of Ribbit connection. And then we want the connection string for our local SQL Express instance, or whatever you are using for a data store. So we want to use the connection string attribute. The server is going to be ./SQL Express if you are using SQL Express. If your database server is on a different computer, then you would obviously want to specify that server name here. The database that we want to use, I'll call Ribbit database. And then we are going to use the trusted connection. Now, you don't want to use the trusted connection whenever you deploy an application. You want to have complete control over what database users can delete and edit and update rows and things like that. But for development purposes, a trusted connection is perfectly fine. So then let's add the provider name, which needs to be system.data.SQL client. And that's the only thing that we need to do in the web.config file, so let's close that. And let's go to our models folder. Let's right click, go to add, and then class. And we are going to add several classes. Now, the beauty about Entity Framework code first is that all we have to do are write what are called POCO classes. It stands for plain old CLR objects. We write these entity classes, and then Entity Framework is going to generate our database and tables based upon our classes. And we really need to keep track of 3 things. We first of all need to store the user information, the username, password, the date that they were created, and things like that. We also need to store the user profile information. And some people would join those 2 things together. But I think that they are 2 separate pieces of data. You have the user information that is strictly for authentication. Then you have the other set of data, which is for information about that user. So those are 2 things. The third thing are the ribbits. We need to keep track of those. And then we also need a class to represent our database. So those are 4 classes that we need to write. Let's start with the user class. This is going to store the username and password. We also want a date for when the user was created. We also have to have a primary key for this table because that is a requirement for Entity Framework. And really, we should always have a primary key for our database tables. So let's create our primary key. We can call this ID, or we can call it user ID. Entity Framework will first look for an int property of ID. If it doesn't find it, then it will look for a property that has the name of the class followed by ID, and it will automatically use that as the primary key. Now, Entity Framework only uses ints for the primary key. I would prefer a GUID, but they only want to use ints, and I guess that's fine. So we need our primary key. We need a property for the username. We also need one for the password, and it would be nice to know when this particular account was created. So we'll call this date created. We also need some way to link a user and their profile together. So let's add a foreign key called user profile ID. We don't have the user profile class, but we will here in a second. So this needs to be get and set. And let's go ahead and create that user profile class. So let's right click once again, add a class, and we'll call this user profile. This is a rather simple class. First of all, we need our primary key. So let's create that ID property. Let's also have a property for the email, because that's something that every account needs to have. We also can have a name that would be displayed. Instead of displaying the username, then they can specify whatever name that they want to display. Let's also have a bio. So we will add that property as well. Let's also add a property for a URL so that the user, if they have a website, can specify their URL. And that finishes our user profile class, so let's close that. Let's go back to our user class. We can use what are called a navigation property. It would give us an API that would look something like this. We could do user and then profile, and then we could access that user's profile by the specified foreign key, user profile ID. So let's create a public virtual property of type user profile, and let's call this profile. Now, by specifying this as virtual, this is going to be lazily loaded. So this data is not going to be loaded unless if we access the profile property. This needs to be get and set, but we also need to specify that this navigation property needs to use the user profile ID property as a foreign key. So we are going to use a foreign key attribute. We need to add a using statement for system.componentModel.dataAnnotations.schema, and then we pass the name of the property that we want to use as the foreign key. So profile ID. Now let's create a class for our ribbits. We'll call this class ribbit, and it is going to be fairly simple as well. Of course, we need our primary key. We also need to know who made a ribbit. So let's create a foreign key property called author ID. We need a property for the message or the status. So we'll call this status. We also need the timestamp, or at least the time and date of when it was created. So we'll call this date created. Now, it would be nice to have an API that would look something like this, so that if we had a ribbit object, then we could get the author of that object by using the author property. So we need another one of these navigation properties. So this needs to be virtual, and it needs to be of type user, and we will call this author. We need to use that foreign key attribute once again, and we will specify author ID as that foreign key. And that's all that we need for this class. So let's close this file, and let's go back to our user class. And let's think about an API that makes it easy to retrieve the ribbits of a user. Well, you can't get any simpler than doing user.ribbits. So let's add a property called ribbits. This needs to be virtual as well, and it will be of type iCollection of ribbit, and we will call it ribbits. But unfortunately, this is not all of the code. Sometimes if we access the ribbits property, it might be null, so we need to take that into account. So let's create a backing field of type iCollection of ribbit, and we'll call it underscore ribbits. The setter is going to be very easy. We just need to set underscore ribbits to the value. So underscore ribbits equals value. And in reality, the getter is also simple. We will return ribbits if it is not null, but if it is null, then we will create a new collection of ribbits. So we will simply return underscore ribbits, and then we will use the null coalescing operator, because if ribbits is null, then we will set ribbits equals a new collection of ribbit. And we need to add a using statement for system.collections.objectModel. And that's it as far as this property. But if we have a property that easily gets the ribbits of a user, we should also have properties to easily get the followers and the people that a user is following. So we can use this same pattern for two more properties, one called followings and the other called followers. But unfortunately, this code is not enough for Entity Framework. We need to manually set up these mappings. And we will do that in our data context class. So I'm going to create a new folder inside of our project called data. And I'm going to add a class called Ribbit Database to this folder. This is going to serve as the Ribbit database. This is also our data context for Entity Framework, so this needs to inherit DB context. But we don't have a reference to Entity Framework, so let's add it to our project. Right-click on References, go to Manage NuGet Packages, and click on Online. Entity Framework is popular, so it will probably be on this first page, but if it's not, you can search for it by just typing Entity Framework. Select that option, click Install, accept the license, and then you will have Entity Framework in your project. So we can go back to our Ribbit database class, and we can add a using statement for system.data.entity. In this class, we need to set up three properties that serve as the tables: the users table, the user profiles table, and the ribbits table. These are of type dbSet of, and then our entity class. So for users, it would be the user class, and we would call this property users. We need a using statement for our user class, and then we add the other two properties. Next, we need to write the code that sets up the mapping for the followers, followings, and the ribbits properties on our user class. So to do that, we need to override a method called onModelCreating. And in this method, we need to call the modelBuilder.entity. We want to specify user, and we want to say that this has many followers with many followings. But then we want to map this to a table. So while we have a table for the users, the user profiles, and the ribbits, we will also have another table for the mapping of the followers and followings. So for this, we will use a lambda expression where we will map the left key as a following ID. We will map the right key as a follower ID. And we want to map this to the table follow. So this is going to create a table called follow. It's going to have a column called following ID and the other called follower ID. And that's all we need to do for the mapping of those properties. We also need to set up the mapping for the ribbits property. So once again, we will use the modelBuilder.entity of user, and we want to say that this has many ribbits. And then at the end, we want to call the base onModelCreating method. The first time that we interact with our database classes, Entity Framework is going to generate our database for us. And we can use our entity classes for querying our database. And we could do that within the controllers if we wanted to, but we don't want to do that. We want our controllers to be as clean as possible. So we are going to add another layer, a repository layer. The repository is going to be responsible for querying our database. And we will add the repository layer in the next lesson.